I feel like I'm kind of the warm-up act for the panel discussion tonight, which I'm really excited to bring up in a little bit. But what I wanted to do is kind of provide a little bit of context from the book, not do a reading from the book, but show you some movie clips and kind of give you some context for what we're going to talk about during the panel, which is really the future of the entertainment industry and how new technologies are shaping it. I want to talk a little bit about the past and show you some movie clips that are really focused on important Oscar-winning movies, since it's Oscar week. So important Oscar-winning movies that have kind of represented turning points in this relationship between Hollywood and new technologies. Before we get started, just kind of one quick thumbnail on how I got interested in this topic and started to write the book. I got invited to an event that took place in 2005 up at the Skywalker Ranch in Marin County, and I feel like Steve or Cliff have been up at some of these gatherings where George Lucas brings together a bunch of directors and technologists and talks about the state of all things digital and cinema. And the thing that struck me, aside from, I went to this event and I obviously didn't know anyone, I didn't know what to wear, I didn't know who to talk to. And you come into this room and it's Lucas and James Cameron and Robert Zemeckis and the founders of Pixar. But the thing that struck me was when they talked about what they were doing, whether it was shooting with a digital camera or doing digital 3D or trying to get movies distributed digitally to cinemas, they were all encountering an enormous amount of resistance of people in the industry telling them why it was too expensive, why the technology wasn't good enough, why it didn't fit into the process. And so I kind of said at that moment in 2005, if these guys who are at the upper echelons of Hollywood are having to fight to get their ideas and their technologies and their new ways of working embraced by the industry, there's kind of a story here. And I started working backwards from what's happening today and learning a little bit about this really interesting series of clashes that the movie industry has had through the years between the innovators, the people who want to do new things either creatively or technologically, and the established industry, kind of the big Hollywood with a capital H. So just to kind of refresh, I know this is mostly a USC audience, so you know all of this history, but just to refresh your memory, I kind of start my history of technology in the industry with these two guys, George Eastman on the left and Thomas Edison on the right. You really couldn't have had the movies if you didn't have Thomas Edison inventing the movie camera and George Eastman inventing this really awesome, flexible celluloid film. If you remember from the Civil War days, right, all the pictures were taken on glass plates or on metal tin types, and you couldn't really run those things through a camera at 24 frames a second. So you needed those two technologies. And Edison also invented this other thing called the kinetoscope, which was kind of like the ancestor of the video iPod, right? You would look into a little window at the upper left-hand corner there, and you had about 30 seconds of film spooled in this big cabinet, and you'd watch like a 30-second silent black and white movie. And it was a very one-to-one personal experience, right? There was no audience. There really was no story. There was no editing. I'll show you this is kind of the inside, what the inside of a kinetoscope parlor would have looked like. And the business model at this point was you pay 25 cents, you go in, and you get to see 8 or 10 or 12 of these 30-second movies that had nothing to do with one another, right? It wasn't we're telling a story. It was in this one you would see a woman dancing. In this one you would see a barber shaving his customer. In this one you would see roosters fighting with one another. That was the movies in about 1894 in Manhattan. This picture, I think, is a kinetoscope parlor in San Francisco. And this is the kind of movie that you would have seen in 1894 as a customer of the kinetoscope parlor. A lot of you are thinking this looks like YouTube. It's not. No, this is a Brazilian circus performer. No one knows if he had any children. So it's not what we would call cinema today. There's no storytelling at all. There's no editing. It's one camera position. And yet, kinetoscope movies were wildly popular, and they started opening up the parlors in New York and London and San Francisco and Los Angeles. And it was a huge business. And Edison, in this business, he was not only making the content, but he was also making the playback devices, making the cameras. He ran the movie studio in New Jersey. So he and Eastman really were the movie industry at this point. And when people started talking about and working on projected movies and projection technology, this is what Edison said about the idea of projecting movies for a big audience. I'll give you a second to read it, but he said, if we put out a screen machine, they'll be used for maybe about 10 of them in the whole United States. Let's not kill this great kinetoscope business that we've got. So even at the very beginning of the industry, you see this tendency to say, things are going great right now, we don't need any new ideas. And what eventually happened was that Edison projection turned out to be popular. People liked seeing movies in a big group where you could kind of laugh along and applaud with your fellow audience members. And Edison had to license some kinetoscope technology, some projection technology from somebody else, and he kind of slapped his name on it and put the Edison brand and made it seem like he had invented this movie projector. This is a movie that many of you will have seen if it wants.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute.
My computer is actually so good with video clips.
I'll give it to him hard. Go right ahead. Goodbye.
All right, it's very appropriate that the jazz singer should be out of sync here. So,
wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you.
All right, so 1927, you have the jazz singer, which everyone thinks of as the first talkie, the first time that someone had tried to connect sound and pictures. And it wasn't the first talkie. Edison had tried to synchronize sound with the pictures. The technology wasn't good enough at the time. You'd have issues like that, where the picture was doing something and the sound was doing something else. Amplification technology wasn't good enough, so it would often just be too quiet. But the Warner Brothers happened to own a radio station in Los Angeles, which is actually still around, called KFWB. And the letters stood for 4 Warner Brothers. And one of the engineers at that radio station started telling them about some technology that AT&T was developing at the Bell Labs in New Jersey, and said, you really should check out the demo. I think it's going to work great. They saw the technology. Most of the Warner Brothers thought that sound would actually be more important for musical performances and not really for dramas, not really for serious movies, but it was all going to be about going to the movies and watching the Boston Symphony Orchestra play or watching the Metropolitan Opera. But they made the jazz singer a huge success in 1927. For about a year, people were lining up outside theaters to get in to see the jazz singer. And I like to show this picture just because it's an example of how rudimentary and kind of brittle and raw the technology was at the time. I mean, you see a whole rack of amplifier equipment. There's still a record player at the center of the projection booth. They were still using records that were just running on the same drive shaft that ran the projector, so theoretically it would run at the same speed. When you started the movie, the projectionist had to sort of put the right frame in the gate and start the record on the exact right groove, and then of course you had to change the records and change the film a couple times during the movie. So it shouldn't have worked. The Warner Brothers were really taking a risk at betting on this kind of technology, but it took off. And I like to show this picture just because this is not a system that that anyone would have considered good enough or reliable enough. The projectionists would check off a box every time they played a Vitaphone record for one of these early Warner Brothers movies, and by the time you played it 20 times, it was worn out, and the Warner Brothers, the company had to send you a new record. So this isn't the technology, obviously, that survived, but it was good enough to really catapult Warner Brothers from this second-tier studio, that was known mostly for the Rin Tin Tin movies, into the top ranks of Hollywood, and they took a lot of the profits that they made from the jazz singer and bought some real estate in Burbank where the studios